You wake up and the voices will not stop. They whisper from the walls, they shout from the rafters, they tell you things no one else can hear. Your hands shake, your chest tightens, you cannot eat, you cannot sleep, you cannot explain what is happening inside your own skull. And it is the year 1187. There is no therapist, there is no diagnosis, there is no pill, there is no language for what you are feeling, not one that anyone around you would understand. Or so you would think. The popular story is that medieval people had no concept of mental illness, that if you lost your mind in the Middle Ages, you were either burned as a witch or locked in a dungeon until you rotted. That the entire medieval world saw madness as nothing but demonic possession, and dealt with it through prayer or violence. That story is mostly wrong. Medieval people did not have our vocabulary, they did not have brain scans or neurotransmitter theory, but they had eyes, they had families, and they had a surprisingly complex set of ideas about what was happening when a person's mind broke down. The first thing you need to understand is the humoral system. For over 1,000 years, educated people across Europe and the Islamic world operated on a medical model inherited from ancient Greece. The body, they believed, was governed by 4 fluids, 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When these humors were in balance, you were healthy. When they fell out of balance, you got sick. Mental illness, in this framework, was a physical problem. Not a spiritual failing, not a punishment from God. A physical problem rooted in the substances inside your body. The most important term here is melancholia, from the Greek melos meaning black and chol meaning bile. Melancholia meant an excess of black bile, and it covered a staggering range of symptoms that we would now recognize as depression, anxiety, obsessive thoughts, paranoia, and even psychosis. The Persian physician Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, wrote extensively about melancholia in his Canon of Medicine around the year 1025. This was not some fringe text. Avicenna's Canon became the standard medical textbook across Europe and the Islamic world for over 500 years. Universities taught it. Physicians quoted it. It shaped how an entire civilization understood the broken mind. Avicenna described melancholic patients who feared things that were not dangerous, who were consumed by suspicion, who withdrew from the world, who could not stop thinking about death. He recommended diet changes, herbal remedies, music, and carefully managed social interaction. Sound familiar? About 200 years later, a Franciscan friar named Bartholomeus Anglicus wrote an encyclopedia called On the Properties of Things. It was one of the most widely read books in medieval England. And Bartholomeus devoted real attention to what he called passions of the soul, conditions where the mind turned against itself. He described people whose imaginations became so disturbed that they saw things, believed things, feared things that had no basis in reality. And crucially, he located the cause not in the devil but in the body, in corrupted humors, in bad digestion, in disrupted sleep, in environmental factors. This was not superstition dressed up as medicine. It was a genuine attempt to explain observable human suffering using the best framework available. But humoral theory was not the only lens. Inside monasteries, monks developed their own vocabulary for mental distress. The most important of these was a word called acedia, sometimes translated as spiritual sloth, but that barely captures it. Acedia was a specific state, a profound inability to care about anything, a crushing boredom that made the monk unable to pray, unable to eat, unable to find meaning in the routines that had structured his entire life. The Desert Fathers, early Christian monks living in the Egyptian desert in the 4th and 5th centuries, wrote about this condition with startling precision. Evagrius Ponticus, one of the most influential of these writers, called acedia the noonday demon. He described how it attacked monks around midday, filling them with restlessness, disgust for their surroundings, and a desperate urge to be somewhere else, anywhere else. Read that description again. Restlessness, disgust for your surroundings, an urge to escape, difficulty finding meaning in daily life. Modern psychologists have pointed out that Evagrius's description of acedia maps almost perfectly onto what we now call clinical depression. The Canadian historian and monk Jean Leclerc spent decades studying these medieval monastic texts and argued that the monks were describing real psychological phenomena, not just spiritual metaphor. And here is where the medieval response gets genuinely surprising. Monasteries did not punish monks for experiencing acedia, they treated it. The prescribed remedies included manual labor, working with your hands to distract the restless mind, changes in diet, walks outside the cloister, conversation with other monks. And critically, the patient was not isolated. They were surrounded by community, they were watched over, they were fed. Compare that to what happened centuries later. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the age of the asylum, people with mental illness were routinely chained to walls, left in their own filth, beaten for displaying symptoms, and exhibited to paying visitors like zoo animals. Bethlem Royal Hospital in London, known as Bedlam, charged admission for the public to come gawk at its patients as entertainment. This was not medieval barbarity. This was Enlightenment-era progress supposedly built on reason and science. The medieval world, for all its limitations, often did better. That does not mean it was gentle. There were absolutely cases of people with severe mental illness being abandoned, cast out of their communities, or left to wander as beggars. Medieval society was brutal in many ways, and not every family had the resources to care for a member who could not function. The chronicles are full of references to innocents and fools, people clearly suffering from severe conditions who existed on the margins of society, sometimes tolerated, sometimes mocked, sometimes exploited. But in many households and many towns, the response to mental illness was simply to care for the person. The medieval historian Sarah Ritchie has documented how religious communities across Europe established informal networks of care for the mentally ill, providing food, shelter, and supervision long before anything resembling a formal hospital system existed. And in the Islamic world, the approach was even more structured. Bimaristans, hospitals established across the medieval Islamic world from the 8th century onward, had dedicated wards for patients with mental illness. The Bimaristan in Cairo, founded in 1284, had separate sections for different conditions, employed musicians to play for patients, and allowed family members to stay. This was organized psychiatric care in the 13th century. So what would actually happen to you, the person hearing voices in 1187? It depended entirely on where you lived, who your family was, and how severe your condition was. If you were wealthy, you might be treated by a physician who prescribed herbal remedies, St. John's wort, valerian, opium poppy extracts, along with dietary changes and rest. The Trocula texts, a collection of medieval medical works from the medical school at Salerno in southern Italy, recommended specific diets for those suffering from disorders of the mind. Avoid heavy foods, drink calming herbal infusions, listen to pleasant music. If you were a peasant, your family would likely keep you at home. They would consult a local healer. They might take you to a church or a shrine where healing miracles were reported. You might be given charms or prayers or herbal concoctions. If your behavior became dangerous, if you were violent, if you were a threat to others, you might be restrained, confined to a room, tied up during your worst episodes. If you were very poor and had no family, you might end up on the road. Medieval cities had populations of wandering, mentally ill people who survived on charity, on alms from churchgoers, on the scraps of tavern kitchens. They were not invisible. They appear in town records, in court rolls, in the margins of legal documents. But they existed in a kind of gray zone between being cared for and being forgotten. One of the most revealing documents comes from the court rolls of medieval England, those painstaking records of local legal proceedings. Scholars like Barbara Hannywalt have mined these rolls to find references to people described as non-compos mentis, not of sound mind. These were formal legal designations. The person was recognized as unable to manage their own affairs, and a guardian was appointed, usually a family member, to handle their property and decisions. This was not a perfect system, but it was a system. Medieval communities had mechanisms for recognizing that a person's mind was not working as it should, and for responding with a mixture of care, supervision, and practical accommodation. The real turning point, the moment when things got worse, not better, came later, much later. In the 16th and 17th centuries, as Europe moved toward the Reformation and then the Enlightenment, the medieval frameworks for understanding mental illness were dismantled. Monasteries were closed. Humoral theory was abandoned, and nothing adequate replaced them. Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, argued in his 1961 work Madness and Civilization that the early modern period saw what he called the Great Confinement, a moment when the mentally ill, who had previously lived among the general population, were suddenly locked away, hidden from sight, declared unfit for society and warehoused in institutions. The medieval approach was imperfect. It was limited by its own worldview. It sometimes failed catastrophically. But it existed within a framework where mental suffering was seen as a human condition, something that happened to a body, to a soul, to a person embedded in a community, not something to be hidden away and forgotten. We like to think we have moved past all of that. We have neuroscience now. We have SSRIs and cognitive behavioral therapy and fMRI machines. We have the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, with its hundreds of precisely categorized conditions. And yet, 1 in 5 adults in the United States experiences a mental illness in any given year. Fewer than half receive treatment. Stigma remains so powerful that many people never seek help at all. We have the vocabulary, we have the science. What we do not always have is the willingness to simply sit with someone who is suffering and say, "You are not broken. You are not cursed. You are not alone." A medieval monk sitting in a stone cloister, fighting the noonday demon, surrounded by brothers who understood his struggle. He might have been closer to recovery than you think. You woke up and the voices would not stop. But you were not thrown away. You were watched over. You were fed. You were given work to quiet your hands and music to quiet your mind. And the people around you, without knowing a single word of modern psychology, understood the most important thing, that a suffering mind does not belong in chains.